Okay, welcome back to the last part of the lecture from Friday, July 20th in IR 102. Having spoken up to this point about bubbles, I'm now going to turn back to something we dealt with a couple days ago, namely the notion of a regime of accumulation. And I want to talk about the particular regime of accumulation that I feel like characterized the Eurozone. The Eurozone is an important case for us in understanding the consequences of the financial crisis that emerged after the bubble I talked about today. To understand the Eurozone, you need to start by knowing that it emerged out of the EU, the European Union. The European Union is a big and politically significant institution uniting a number of European countries which joined on the dates you can see on this chart. It consists of a unified internal market, so a lot of alignment of regulations that make it possible to trade more or less seamlessly across national borders, including, with some limitations and variations over time, freedom of movement across different national labor markets. So for the moment, somebody who's a British citizen can go freely to work in Spain and vice versa. It has an executive authority called the European Commission, which can't entirely tell national governments what to do, but helps to draft and implement a large number of regulations that apply across the European Union, and it has a legislative authority that is weaker than a national parliament, but again helps to draft and especially exercise oversight over institutions that apply across the EU. So that's a very, very basic and approximate picture of what the EU is. In 1993, the European Union decided that it would be a good idea to set up a unified currency. And this currency became known as the euro. And if you travel to the countries that use the euro, including, for instance, Ireland or France or Germany or Italy, all use the same currency. Prior to the euro, they had their own different currencies, but as of 1999, the exchange rates between these currencies were fixed and they all started using the same currency. The Maastricht Treaty set up an independent central bank, probably the most independent central bank in the world, because its powers were fixed in treaty, so it wasn't easy to revise those, and there is no elected government that could tell it what to do. It is supposed to be independent from all of the individual elected governments. There are procedures for how people get applied to it, but the leader gets applied for a very long term. It's not easy to remove people from the decision-making council of the European Central Bank. It is a very independent central bank in the sense that we were talking about yesterday. In order to ensure a general harmony in economic policy before the institution of the euro, before the launch of the common currency, the signatories to the Maastricht Treaty were required to meet something known as the Maastricht criteria, limitations on budget deficits and total debt. These limitations were not only meant to apply to the period before entering the common currency, but also afterwards. They, in fact, were very widely fudged or approximated at the moment of setting up the common currency, probably nowhere more fudged and approximated than in Greece, but fudged and approximated in many different countries. One thing to notice right away about the Maastricht Treaty is that given that it limited government deficit spending or state deficit spending and set up a very independent central bank, and that independent central bank had one mandate, which was to deal with inflation, not to think about unemployment or anything else, the Maastricht Treaty reflected a moment in time in which Keynesian demand stimulus of the sort we talked about earlier this week was considered unimportant and indeed perhaps even dangerous because it involved increased government borrowing, and there was a fear that this borrowing would be dangerous or unsustainable. It's often said that the EU and the Eurozone in particular are neoliberal institutions, and I think that there is a sense in which that is true if you think about what neoliberal means. After World War II, market liberalism, the idea that a policy of laissez-faire, of letting people do what they want, will lead to good economic outcomes, faced very serious political challenges. This discussion, by the way, of liberalism and neoliberalism frames a lot of the history that you talked about in the first part of the course. So liberalism advocated a minimal state role in the economy, although that role should include very vigorous defenses of property rights, upholding a monetary system, and so on. But nonetheless, the idea was, even if the practice wasn't always, the idea was a minimal state role in the economy, laissez-faire, letting people do what they wanted to do. But as policymakers sought to reconstruct the world economy after World War II, they found themselves faced with two difficulties. Keynesianism implied that there ought to be regular economic implosions without an active state role in managing the economy. As we saw earlier this week, the constant shortfalls in demand meant that demand and growth were reliant on investment. Investment was fickle, so there might be regular economic implosions unless there was an active state role in managing the economy. Indeed, the Great Depression seemed to be proof of the importance of Keynesian points. A second problem that advocates of market liberalism faced after World War II is that they would have to push against the increasingly widespread recognition of a point that I've made a number of times in the few days you've heard me speak, that the state has a pervasive and massive role in creating the conditions for a market economy. So if neoliberalism was going to succeed in reconstructing liberalism, if advocates of market liberalism were going to get anywhere, they needed to figure out a way to deal with that pervasive and massive role of the state in creating the preconditions for a market economy. So that was what neoliberals set out to do. This is a story of people who initially were very distant from the centers of power, whose ability to shape economic policy was quite limited. People whose names are now quite famous, like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, leaders of the neoliberal movement, were, in the immediate post-war period, bereft of much influence over practical policy. They were thinking about how can we build a new kind of liberalism that could actually get some political influence. And the intellectual project was to reconstruct a way of thinking about what it would mean for the state not to intervene in the economy. Having recognized that the state must act to underpin markets, how can intellectual and practical limits be set on this action? So neoliberals came up with a number of ideas about what the limits to the state might be and how to set limits on state action. They suggested that one ought to avoid public ownership because it created bad incentives for businesses. They argued that states, yes, must act in the economy, but they must not intervene in a discretionary, case-by-case fashion, that they ought to act according to general rules. To do otherwise, the neoliberals argue, would undermine the rule of law. It would discourage investment because without stable rules, businesses wouldn't know what environment they would face when their investments needed to pay off. The neoliberals argued that when states act in a discretionary fashion, when they change the rules as things go along, they will act in ways that promote bad behavior. For instance, they may say businesses that can't make ends meet have to fail and go out of business. That's what creates a good, efficient market economy. But a state that can violate that rule, that can do a discretionary action to bail out or help a particular business, will simply encourage irresponsible behavior in the first place, and also encourage rent seeking, which is to say, encourage efforts to shape markets in a way that guarantee above competitive returns to particular actors. Finally, neoliberals underpinned all of these arguments about the bad consequences of discretionary intervention by arguing that all of them were based on what they called a conceit of knowledge, that markets were better, they argued, at processing information than bureaucrats. Bureaucrats simply couldn't know what the best economic policy was, and so having bureaucratic discretion in how to deal with markets was a recipe for continual mistakes. It was best to act according to rules fixed and announced in advance, and that would avoid the conceit of knowledge, at least on this argument. So that's a very, very, very quick picture of neoliberalism, and if you accept that description of neoliberalism, you can certainly see that in the broad, there are neoliberal features to the EU and to the Eurozone as well. It's a heavily rule-bound polity, a heavily rule-bound arena. There are rules on how the internal market is supposed to work. There are rules on discretionary state policy in support of business. Furthermore, the Maastricht criteria were intended to limit budgetary discretion. So again, this idea that the states shouldn't act in a discretionary fashion. And finally, the idea that the European Central Bank ought to be independent from political authorities and act in a rule-bound way reflected the same spirit. All of that being said, it also needs to be emphasized, as it was in the lectures earlier by Dr. Hopkin, that there's extreme diversity in the provision of welfare across different states, including across different states within the EU and within the Eurozone, and that very often states that are in the EU and the Eurozone have a more generous welfare state than those that are outside. So the idea that it could be viewed as a purely neoliberal project might be a bit strong. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the intellectual political background to the EU and the Eurozone. Let's talk about why the Eurozone came into existence. The Eurozone came into existence as part of the general decline of Keynesian demand management, something we'll talk a little bit more about in topic 10 on Monday, but it's also pertinent to the transition from Fordism or classical Keynesianism that we talked about when we were talking about regimes of accumulation to privatized Keynesianism. The Eurozone emerged in the period after the Keynesian paradigm was perceived as being exhausted. And one of the things it was supposed to accomplish was create a new framework for policy making after the decline of Keynesianism. A second purpose of the Eurozone, and probably the most crucial one, was to bring some order to exchange rate management. And why this might be necessary, what exactly is involved in exchange rate management, we will now discuss. And we'll talk about, in particular, exchange rates between different currencies and how they affect competitiveness. I've shown on this slide here the way that exchange rates work. So what we have is a t-shirt, right? We have a t-shirt that, say, is priced at £1 in the UK, and let's say it's priced at 110 francs. Francs was the currency of France that no longer exists since they've got the euro. The exchange rate relates francs to pounds. 100 francs per pound means that the t-shirt costs £1.10 if it costs 110 francs. If those were the prices, £1, 110 francs, and 100 francs per pound is the exchange rate, that means that French goods are uncompetitive, right? So we immediately see that exchange rates have a big significance for competitiveness. If you're interested in this topic, I direct your attention to some tweets by the President of the United States that were made on Friday, July 20th, in which he talks about the need to maintain a weak exchange rate for the United States to avoid it becoming less competitive. So we'll see why one might make that case in just a moment. Okay, so suppose France is facing a situation where its goods are uncompetitive. How can it deal with that situation? Well, one way to do it was, if our t-shirt costs too much, let's make it cost less. It costs 110 francs now, let's reduce it, say, to 92 francs. If France manages to do that, or the t-shirt producer manages to do that, and it's 100 francs per pound, now the t-shirt costs only 92 pence, and indeed it is competitive with the UK t-shirt, and the UK t-shirt is now uncompetitive. But as we saw when we were talking about central banking, deflation is a hard thing to do. It's very damaging for businesses, right? The t-shirt maker has all of these costs that it expected to pay back at one level of prices. If prices fall, it's very hard for it to pay back those costs. So deflation is very difficult, which means that very often an alternative way of restoring competitiveness is to change the exchange rate. For instance, to allow the exchange rate to change from 100 francs per pound to 120 francs per pound. That accomplishes just the same thing, right? It also reduces the price of the t-shirt to 92 pence and makes it competitive with the British one. However, it avoids doing so through devaluation. There's a final way that this situation of uncompetitiveness might be dealt with, and that's through trade protection, tariff barriers. Instead of France saying, okay, we will make our t-shirt's price more competitive with the price of the British t-shirt, we'll just prevent people from importing British t-shirts. We'll ban them. And then, even though French consumers would prefer to buy the British t-shirt, they don't do so because the tariff, the import tariff, the trade protection, makes it more expensive. So this is the basic picture about exchange rates and competitiveness. And if you remember from our lecture earlier, I talked about how in the immediate post-World War II period, there was a period of relatively fixed exchange rates known as part of the Bretton Woods arrangements, but by the 1970s, those arrangements had come apart, and countries were in a position to allow their exchange rates to move against one another. The EU, because it now, the Eurozone, because it has a single currency and has free trade within it, has ruled out some kinds of policies that deal with competitiveness problems. Devaluation is now off the table. When all countries use the same currency, they can't use devaluation as a tool of adjusting relative prices. Similarly, when protection is banned, when tariffs are banned, that also can't be used as a reaction to uncompetitive goods. This means that the only way of dealing with a competitiveness problem is to permit deflation, to allow prices to change in nominal terms. So the effect of the Eurozone on the adjustment of competitiveness across different countries is to make it all about movements in relative prices. Devaluation and protection cannot be used to restore competitiveness anymore. So what's the effect of that? Well, it puts an enormous emphasis on inflation rates and whether inflation rates are the same in different countries. Now, it's important to note that if one country's price level is rising faster than another, its goods will be less competitive, right? If the French t-shirt's price is rising faster than the British t-shirt's price, the French t-shirts are going to be getting less competitive. What this means is that with fixed exchange rates, as in the Eurozone, and indeed even with relatively inflexible exchange rates, as in some other cases, the ability of a country to hold down inflation is key to maintaining its competitiveness. This is important because preventing inflation or relatively faster inflation in the first place is a lot easier than organizing deflation. Deflation tends to create a downward economic spiral and politically very difficult. We talked about that earlier. So now we're in a position to relate this discussion of the basics of the competitiveness of international trade to the reasons for the Eurozone. Before the currency union, Germany relied very heavily on exports. So we talked about the different possible sources of demand, and exports as a source of demand, but not every country can export more than it imports. Germany relied very heavily on exports. And in order to ensure that it could keep exporting, it tried to and was successful in maintaining a very low inflation rate. So just going back to the slide from the other day, you can see that Germany, through the whole post-war period, relied very heavily on trade surpluses. This is the current account balance, but that's very similar to the trade surplus. Other countries, France, Spain, Italy, which had higher inflation, tended to deal with competitiveness problems by devaluing their currencies. So the kind of stereotype was that the Deutschmark, the German currency, was strong, and the lira and the franc were weaker currencies which would regularly devalue. So as countries were thinking about why to launch a single currency, there were a lot of different motivations, but the key ones were, for Germany, the chance to eliminate competitive devaluation by key trade partners. So Germany would be selling lots of cars to France, German industry would be doing well, and then France would devalue the franc, and French consumers couldn't afford as many cars. French cars were more competitive. Germany wanted to stop that from being possible. Well, why would France or other countries ever want to go along with that? Well, for them, they really thought that this was a chance to deal with their relatively high inflation rates, and they hoped that, just like in the rationale for establishing an independent central bank, signing up to a single currency would give a credible commitment to low inflation and allow them to keep low inflation rates. What happened in practice? Fascinatingly, what happened in practice is that differential inflation rates persisted even though there was a single currency. So the bottom line here is the inflation, the price level in Germany. So if you take prices as in 1999 as 1, how much of price has gone up by particular dates? By 2011, they'd gone up, say, by 25%. But that was way less than it had gone up in other countries. So Germany had a much lower inflation rate than other countries. What that meant was, since all of the countries were using the same currency, the price of German goods was going up much slower than the price of other goods, and German goods were getting much more competitive than the goods of other Eurozone countries. Now, this difference in inflation rates across different countries had the effect of, in Minskian terms, a displacement. It created a kind of boom-bust cycle because it created multiple stimuli for investment and capital inflows in those countries with above average inflation. Just think about it this way. You've got two places you might invest. In one place, prices are going up fast, and in the other place, they're not going up very fast. Where do you want to invest? Where they're going up fast, because that's where consumers are going to have more to spend, right? It's where housing prices are going to be going up more and so on and so forth. So, I mean, that's the basic picture. The countries that were experiencing higher inflation were getting less competitive in terms of their exports, but they were more exciting in terms of places to invest because prices were going up, and you could just, stuff you bought today would be worth more tomorrow. So in those places where inflation was high, real interest rates, which are interest rates corrected for inflation, were relatively low. So countries which had relatively high inflation rates borrowed, their governments borrowed, their businesses borrowed very eagerly because it was relatively cheap to pay them back. This helped to contribute to the eventual fiscal crisis in Greece. Furthermore, those countries which had relatively fast increases in prices experienced increasingly low competitiveness, um, and at the same time as their goods were becoming less competitive, their consumers were becoming richer, meaning they could afford more to buy more stuff. This tended to fuel bigger trade deficits in the countries which had higher inflation rates, and correspondingly inflows, capital inflows that needed to cover those trade deficits. You can look back to the discussion of symmetric and asymmetric adjustment from a couple of lectures ago to understand that. So capital is flowing into the countries with higher inflation rates for the reasons I've already talked about. Furthermore, it was very simple to see that in a country which has a kind of ongoing inflationary process, if you can predict that that's going to happen and this became a stable pattern, you can make bets on it, bets based on investing in that country, sort of one-way based bets. So this contributed to big housing booms, quite similar to the housing boom in the US, although the financing mechanisms weren't exactly the same, in Ireland and Spain. All of these things worked in reverse in countries with lower inflation rates, less investment, more exports, and so on. So you had the effect of putting all these countries together in a single currency union was to create differential inflation rates that set off a boom in some countries and were less favorable for other countries, and created various kinds of bubbles and high levels of investment that relied on unification of countries with different inflation rates under a single currency. So these processes show up very clearly in the statistics. Here's the current account, or again, basically the trade surplus of Germany versus the rest of the Eurozone. Here's the date at which the euro is introduced, and you can see that the German surplus goes way up. Now, sometimes people talk about this as reflecting different varieties of capitalism. Without getting into the details, which you could read a little bit more about here on this slide, it's argued by the political economist Peter Hall in this vein. The northern European countries, and especially Germany, are very good at restraining wages and keeping inflation rates down, whereas the southern countries are less good at that, and as a result, the northern countries tend to rely more on export demand because they can maintain competitiveness, and the southern countries tend to rely more on domestic demand. And so he looks at growth in domestic demand across different countries in the Eurozone and draws a big contrast between Germany and a lot of other countries. And indeed, if you look at the Eurozone as a whole, you see that domestic consumption was a big share of where growth came from. So these are shares of the different sources of demand in total growth. Household consumption was the biggest single item in Eurozone growth up until the crisis. There was investment, government consumption, trade surplus were all part of the growth, but it was really household final consumption, and that was especially consumption in what Hall called the southern countries, but basically the countries other than Germany, to make it simple. Germany had a very different picture. Germany's growth, to the extent that it grew in 2000 2008, was almost entirely based on its trade surplus. Very little growth derived from household final consumption or government final consumption, and investment was, again, almost stagnant. So it was the trade surplus that really drove German growth. So you had a very different, it is true that there were very different models of demand between Germany and other parts of the zone. So Hall suggests that this was because of differences in wage coordination mechanisms, that Germany was able to ensure unified bargaining among wage earners in a way that restrained wages, whereas this was not practical in other countries. If we look at this, we ought to expect that it will work as follows. The coordinated wage bargaining leads to wage gains in line with productivity and export success, given the fixed exchange rate, right? Because elsewhere where this wasn't happening, where wage gains were outstripping productivity, you would get weak exports and strong domestic demand. And if you look at labor costs, the most common way that it's reported is these nominal unit labor costs, and it looks like here's Germany down here keeping nominal unit labor costs very low. In other countries, the wages are going up faster. What's unit labor costs? Unit labor costs is the amount of wages in the final price of a product. So if the product costs €1 and 20 euro pence of that go to wages, that is the unit labor cost is 1/5 or 20%. Nominal unit labor costs are corrected for inflation, and so what they really measure is whether or not the share of labor is going up faster than inflation. But Hall's argument isn't about the relationship between the share of labor and the rate of inflation. Hall's argument is about whether or not wage gains outstrip productivity. If you look at that, it turns out that this is the cumulative change in labor costs as a share of output since 1999. People who argue that varieties of capitalism drive differences across Eurozone countries need to say, look, those countries that did the best in restraining labor's share of costs also saw the lowest overall increases in prices. So if we look, though, at the change in labor costs as a share of output since 1999, which are the countries that had the biggest restraint up until 1999? Well, certainly Germany, shown in black, but also Ireland and also Spain, shown in brown for a very long period, had quite restrained wages. So the whole argument, the argument from varieties of capitalism, doesn't really work. And if you look at what happened in Germany, it is true that there's a lot of wage coordination in Germany, and so those are the collectively bargained wages. But those wages, with exceptions, but more or less, they kept somewhat closer to rises in labor productivity. The real change in Germany was that there were an increasing number of people that were not captured by the collective bargaining, and that it was those uncoordinated wages that were held down. So it seems like it really wasn't about coordination. And instead, what was going on was differential inflation rates driven by the phenomena I talked about earlier, the phenomena of a feedback loop between higher inflation, capital inflows, increased investment, you want to invest where prices are going up fastest. All of those things work together to reproduce higher inflation rates, and it didn't have anything to do with different kinds of labor coordination. So if you think about things in that way, you can then see why you might think of the Eurozone as a failed regime of accumulation. Just think about the four elements of a regime of accumulation that we talked about before. We had demand. It was export-led in Germany, but in the periphery was more domestic demand-led, but that meant continual capital inflows. So we think about finance, international financing of trade deficits, and some privatized Keynesianism in the deficit states, which was vulnerable to a collapse in financial markets. So just like the general phenomenon of privatized Keynesianism in some parts of the Eurozone was vulnerable to a collapse in international finance, which we saw after 2008. Investment was weak in the Eurozone's largest economy of Germany, and it was dependent on growth in the borrowing countries. So investment wasn't a stable source of demand, right? in Bloch's definition of a regime of accumulation, you need to have a way of organizing the structure of demand such that businesses will consistently invest. That hadn't been accomplished in the Eurozone. And finally, international arrangements. The Eurozone didn't have any set of arrangements for dealing with trade imbalances in a symmetric fashion. Instead, what you got was up through 2008 the continual growth of trade imbalances. So you could go back to the slide that I had earlier on the growth of Germany's trade surplus. And then when the crisis hit, a very rapid and asymmetric adjustment. And it's that adjustment we're going to talk about on Monday. So what I hope that this presentation has done is let you learn something about the origins of the Eurozone, the relationship between exchange rates and competitiveness, what happens when you take exchange rates as a tool of competitive management off the table, and how that affected the development of the Eurozone. And most generally, I want to use the Eurozone as an example of how this idea of a regime of accumulation can help you make sense of the pattern of economic policy, the pattern of economic growth, and whether or not it will be sustainable. The consequences of the unsustainable Eurozone regime of accumulation we'll talk about in Monday's lecture when we talk about what happened after the crisis of 2008. Okay, I hope you're going to have or have already had a good weekend, and I'll talk to you soon.